Hello, everyone. Tonight, I want to tell you a story. A story about a secret buried for a decade. A ghost from the past that came back to haunt a perfect life. It all began in the quiet, unassuming town of Willow Creek, where nothing ever really happens. Or so it seems. Our story's main character is Sarah, a woman in her early 30s. Sarah was, by all accounts, a woman who had it all. She had a loving husband, David, a kind and dedicated man who worked as a successful architect. They lived in a beautiful, sprawling house on the outskirts of town, with a meticulously kept garden that was the envy of their neighbors. Sarah herself was a respected history teacher at the local high school. Her life was a picturesque scene, a perfect portrait of suburban bliss. But beneath the surface of this idyllic life, a tiny crack was about to appear, and it would eventually shatter everything. It started innocently enough. Sarah was helping her best friend, Emily, plan her wedding. Emily was a free spirit, a whirlwind of energy and optimism, and her wedding was going to be a grand affair. The centerpiece of it all was, of course, the dress. Emily had found her dream dress at a boutique in the next town over, a place called Eternity Bridal. It was a small, quaint shop that had been in business for decades. As Sarah and Emily were browsed through the racks, an older woman with a kind face and silver hair, the owner of the shop, approached them. Her name was Mrs. Gable. She and Sarah struck up a conversation, and Sarah mentioned her own wedding, which had been a quiet, intimate affair 10 years ago. A small, almost imperceptible shift crossed Mrs. Gable's face. "Oh," she said, her voice a little softer. "I remember you. Or I remember an order. A long time ago." Sarah's heart did a tiny flutter. She hadn't bought her dress here. She and David had eloped, and she'd worn a simple, off-the-rack gown. She was about to correct Mrs. Gable when the woman continued, "Yes, a beautiful lace gown. I remember the name on the order. Sarah Montgomery." Sarah froze. Montgomery was her maiden name. A cold dread began to creep up her spine. "I think you have me confused with someone else," Sarah said, forcing a polite smile. "My husband and I eloped. We didn't have a big wedding." Mrs. Gable's kind smile faltered. "But the order was here. Cancelled, of course. A decade ago. I've always had a good memory for these things. The name was so distinctive. Sarah Montgomery. The date. It was the same week as your elopement, wasn't it?" The room seemed to shrink around Sarah. The vibrant chatter of the other brides, the soft classical music playing, all faded into a dull buzz. The air grew heavy, thick with unspoken questions. An order for a wedding dress, under her maiden name, from a decade ago, cancelled. The same week she and David had run away to get married. She remembered that week with startling clarity. The whirlwind romance with David, the sudden, impulsive decision to elope. Her parents had been heartbroken, but she'd been so in love, so swept up in the moment. The idea of a traditional wedding had seemed like a hassle, an unnecessary formality. But an order for a wedding dress? A beautiful lace gown? Who had placed it? Why had it been cancelled? The questions circled in her mind, a flock of angry crows. David knew everything about her. They had no secrets. He was her rock, her confidant, her one true love. The thought that he might have lied to her, even about something so seemingly small, was a splinter of ice in her heart. She excused herself from Emily, mumbling something about a headache, and left the shop in a daze. The drive home was a blur. She felt a profound sense of disorientation, as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted. She looked at her hands on the steering wheel, at the simple gold band on her left finger, a symbol of a life she thought she knew completely. But did she? That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed next to David, his steady, peaceful breathing a stark contrast to the storm raging inside her. She wanted to ask him, to confront him, but the words wouldn't come. She was afraid of what she might find, afraid of the perfect facade crumbling around her. She was a history teacher, a person who dealt in facts and verifiable truths. But this felt like a ghost story, a forgotten chapter of her life suddenly reappearing. The memory of Mrs. Gable's words, the cancelled order, the beautiful lace gown. It was a loose thread, a thread that, if pulled, could unravel the entire tapestry of her life, and she felt an irresistible urge to pull it. She had to know. The question wasn't just about a dress anymore. It was about the foundation of her marriage, the truth of her past, the very essence of who she was. The innocent visit to a bridal shop had opened a door to a darkness she didn't know existed, and she was now standing on the precipice, looking into the abyss. The abyss was deeper than Sarah could have ever imagined. That night, she didn't confront David. She couldn't. The fear was too great, and the lack of concrete proof made her feel foolish, paranoid. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing into a thorny, choking vine. She started looking at David differently. Every smile, every gentle touch, every "I love you" felt tainted. A performance in a play she didn't know the script to. The next day, she decided to start her own investigation. A secret mission that felt both thrilling and terrifying. She couldn't ask David directly, so she had to find her own answers. The first place she went was her old family home. Her parents had moved to Florida years ago, but the house was still in the family, occupied by her older brother, Mark. Mark was always the protective, stable one, and Sarah felt a pang of guilt at the thought of involving him in her mess. But he was her only link to the past, a past she now realized she might not know completely. She visited him under the pretense of looking for old photo albums for Emily's wedding slideshow. As she sifted through boxes of dusty memories in the attic, she casually brought up her and David's elopement. "Do you remember that week? Mom and Dad were so upset. It all happened so fast." Mark's face, etched with a decade of time and responsibility, softened. "I do," he said. "I remember thinking it was so unlike you, Sarah. You were always the one who dreamed of a big white wedding, the whole fairy tale. The one who had everything planned out since you were a little girl." A shiver ran down Sarah's spine. The memory of a younger, more naive Sarah, one who meticulously planned every detail of her future, was a ghost of its own. She remembered doodling wedding dresses in her school notebooks, imagining a beautiful lace gown. Was it a coincidence? Or was it a forgotten piece of a puzzle she was just starting to put together? As she dug deeper into the boxes, she found a box labeled Sarah's college stuff. Inside, buried beneath old textbooks and photo albums, was a small, worn leather journal. Her journal from college. She'd completely forgotten about it. She tucked it into her purse, her heart pounding. This felt like a betrayal, a violation of her own privacy, but she was desperate. That night, in the quiet of her study, while David was asleep, she opened the journal. The entries from a decade ago were filled with the dreams and anxieties of a young woman on the cusp of adulthood. She read about her classes, her friends, her hopes for the future. And then she found it, an entry dated just a few months before she met David. The entry was about a man named Michael, a kind, quiet man she had met at a university event. She wrote about how he was the one, the man she would spend her life with. She wrote about her dreams of a future with him, a future that included a beautiful white wedding with a lace gown, the very same one Mrs. Gable had described. And then, there was a series of frantic, panicked entries. Michael had disappeared. He had vanished without a trace, no goodbye, no explanation. She wrote about her devastation, her confusion, her broken heart. And then, the entries stopped. Just a few weeks later, her first entry about David appeared. The whirlwind romance, the quick engagement, the elopement. It was as if her life with Michael had been completely erased, a memory she had consciously or subconsciously buried. But the most damning piece of information was in the last entry about Michael. She had written about a conversation with David, just a few days after Michael's disappearance. She had told David about her heartbreak, and he had been a comforting presence. She had also mentioned to David that she had put down a deposit on a wedding dress, a detail she had confided in him as a sign of how serious she was about Michael. The entry ended with her expressing her fear and confusion about Michael's sudden disappearance and how David was helping her get through it. The puzzle pieces were clicking into place, forming a horrifying picture. David wasn't just a comforting presence. He was the one who knew about the dress, about the order. He was the one who had been there at the time. Could he have had a motive? The thought was insane, but it was the only one that made sense. Why would he have let her forget? Why had she blocked out such a significant part of her life? The journal entries created a new, darker narrative. Her marriage to David was no longer a beautiful, spontaneous romance. It was built on a foundation of lies, a forgotten past, and a man named Michael. The blissful life she had known was a carefully constructed fiction, and she was the last to know. She looked at her wedding photos on the mantelpiece, at the happy couple smiling back at her. The smiles felt hollow, and the love in their eyes felt like a lie. She was trapped in a marriage that was a beautiful cage, a prison built with her own forgotten memories. The canceled dress order was not just a detail. It was a crime scene, a clue to a much larger, more sinister story, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that David was at the center of it all. The calm before the storm was over. The storm was here, and it was ready to tear her world apart. The quiet of the house was now a suffocating silence, each ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway a hammer blow to Sarah's fragile peace. The journal was still open on her desk, the words a damning indictment against the man she loved. She reread the last entry about Michael, the one where she had mentioned the deposit on the dress to David. It was a detail so specific, so personal, a vulnerability she had shared with him during her darkest time. And he had used it. That's the only conclusion she could draw. She felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was a carefully orchestrated scheme, a manipulation of her grief. He had swooped in, the perfect knight in shining armor, to comfort the damsel in distress. But the damsel's distress, she now realized, might have been of his own making. She had to get to the truth, the whole truth, and there was only one person who could give it to her, Michael. But Michael had disappeared a decade ago. He was a ghost. She had to find a way to find a ghost. Her first step was to revisit the past in a more direct way. She went to the university's registrar office under a false pretense, claiming she was writing a historical piece on her graduating class. She looked up Michael's student records. His full name was Michael Sterling. His last known address was a small apartment near campus. She drove there. The building was old, and the apartment was now occupied by a young couple who had no idea who Michael was. The trail was cold, but a name and a date were a start. She decided to use the skills she had as a history teacher, digging through public records, old news archives, anything she could find. She searched for Michael Sterling disappearance from 10 years ago. Nothing. No police reports, no missing persons filings, no articles in the local paper. It was as if he had never existed. This was a deeper mystery than she had thought. Someone had gone to great lengths to erase him. Her investigation took a dark turn when she discovered a small, local newspaper from a neighboring county. Buried deep within the archives was a tiny, almost missed article. It wasn't about Michael. It was about a fire. A small, suspicious fire at a local business, a construction company, just a few days after Michael's disappearance. The owner of the company was a man named Mr. Thompson. The article mentioned that the company had been on the verge of bankruptcy, facing a lawsuit from a disgruntled former employee. The former employee's name wasn't listed, but the article mentioned the police were investigating a possible arson. The business was also an architectural firm. A partner in the firm, a young, promising architect, was the one who discovered the fire. His name was David. The world seemed to spin on its axis. Sarah grabbed the table for support, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. David had worked for a small architectural firm before starting his own. He had told her that the firm had closed down suddenly, and he had been a victim of circumstance, forced to start his own business. He had never mentioned a fire. He had never mentioned a lawsuit. He had never mentioned the owner's name, Mr. Thompson. And Michael. What was the connection? She remembered the journal entry about Michael and a man named Mr. Thompson. Michael had been working for him, an internship at a construction company. He was preparing to file a lawsuit against the company, claiming financial misconduct. He had confided in her, and she had written it all down. She had even written that David, her then friend, had offered to help her with legal advice, having some connections in the business world. The pieces slammed together with a terrifying force. David hadn't just been a comfort to her. He had been a spy. He had gained her trust, learned about Michael's plans, and then, she realized, he must have gone to Mr. Thompson, warning him about the impending lawsuit, the fire, a convenient way to destroy all the incriminating financial records. And Michael, he had to have been a victim of this conspiracy. He hadn't just disappeared. He had been silenced. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The perfect life she had was a trophy, a prize for David's ultimate betrayal. He had stolen her love, erased her past, and built his successful life on the ashes of another man's future. Her love, their marriage, their entire life together was a lie built on a foundation of deceit and possibly murder. She wasn't just a woman with a secret past. She was a witness to a crime, a victim in a decade-long cover-up. She stood in the middle of her beautiful home, the home that David had designed and built, and it felt like a mausoleum. The walls seemed to close in on her, whispering the ghosts of her past. Her husband, the man she shared a bed with, was a monster. He had orchestrated the entire thing, a quiet, sinister campaign to get what he wanted. She had to get away. She had to expose him. But she knew that David was a dangerous man, a man who could erase a life to get what he wanted. She was no longer just a woman seeking the truth. She was a woman in peril, trapped in a gilded cage with a predator. The final piece of the puzzle, the one that would shatter everything, was waiting for her in the form of a phone call. She found a contact number for Mr. Thompson listed in the old archives, now a number for a nursing home. He was old, frail, and his memory was fading. But he remembered the fire. He remembered David. And he remembered the young man who had been so close to uncovering the truth. The man who had been planning to marry a beautiful girl named Sarah. The conversation was brief, but it confirmed everything. David had orchestrated the fire and had paid Mr. Thompson to keep quiet. But the biggest shock was the final piece of information. Michael was not dead. He was in hiding, living under a new name, a broken man who had lost everything. The conspiracy was not just a crime of the past. It was an ongoing tragedy, a living, breathing nightmare. The revelation that Michael was alive, but broken, was a final, devastating twist. It wasn't just a story of greed and betrayal. It was a story of a life stolen, a future erased. Sarah's marriage was not just built on a lie, but on the living ghost of a man who had lost everything because of it. The gilded cage she was in felt less like a prison and more like a tomb. She had to act, and she had to be careful. David was not just a liar. He was a predator who had meticulously planned his life, building it on the ruins of another. She knew she couldn't confront him directly. He would deny everything, and she had no concrete proof, just the fading memories of an old man and a decade-old journal she had to keep hidden. Her next step had to be to find Michael. He was the key. He was the one person who could truly expose David for what he was. Using the information from her conversation with Mr. Thompson and her skills in digging through old records, she was able to track down Michael's new identity. He was living in a different state, under the name Mark Jones, and working as a freelance carpenter. The man who was once a bright, ambitious architect was now a ghost of himself, a man who had lost his career, his dreams, and the woman he loved. She drove for 2 days to get to him, the long journey giving her time to process the magnitude of the truth. When she finally found his workshop, it was a small, dusty garage filled with the smell of sawdust and old wood. A man with a tired face and haunted eyes looked up from his work. He was not the confident, hopeful Michael she had known from her journal. This man was a shell of himself, a person who had spent a decade running from a past he couldn't escape. She introduced herself as Sarah Montgomery, a name that was like a ghost to him, the name on the canceled wedding dress order, the one that had been the last symbol of a life that was taken from him. At first, he was defensive, even hostile, his fear a palpable thing. But as Sarah started talking, weaving the story of the wedding dress, the canceled order, her journal, and the fire, his guardedness began to crumble. He told her his side of the story, the details of the lawsuit he was about to file, the strange phone call he received from a friend of a friend who warned him to back off. The friend, he now realized, was David, a man he had met a few times through Sarah. The fire, the threats, the fear that had forced him to disappear and start a new life, a life of quiet desperation. The moment they connected their stories, a decade of lies was finally unraveled. The puzzle was complete, and the picture was a monstrous one. The truth was not just that David had manipulated her, but that he had ruined Michael's life to get her. He hadn't just stolen her, he had stolen his identity, his future, his very existence. Sarah knew what she had to do. With Michael's testimony and the evidence she had gathered, they had a chance. She contacted a lawyer, an old friend of her brother's, and began the long, arduous process of building a case. It was a secret operation, a quiet rebellion against the man who had controlled her life for so long. She started packing not her beautiful clothes, but the evidence, the journal, the old articles. She was no longer a wife. She was a witness. The final scene of this story takes place in the very house David and Sarah had built together. Sarah waited until David came home, the air heavy with a tension that was almost unbearable. He came in, his face a mask of his usual calm, his perfect smile in place. He asked her about her day, and for the first time in a decade, she didn't lie. She looked him in the eyes and said, "I know." The mask slipped. The calm facade shattered. The monster beneath the perfect skin was finally revealed. David's face twisted with rage and panic. He lunged at her, but she was ready. The police, whom she had called just moments before, were already waiting outside. The last thing she saw was the look on David's face as the police lights flashed through the windows. A look of a man who had finally lost control of the perfect world he had so meticulously built. This story is a cautionary tale about the lies we tell ourselves and the secrets we bury. It's a story about a woman who had to shatter her perfect life to find the truth, and a man who lost everything because he tried to steal it. The wedding dress order, a forgotten detail from a decade ago, was not just an item on a receipt. It was a witness to a crime, a silent testament to a conspiracy that almost succeeded. And while Sarah found justice, and Michael found a chance at peace, the scars of this long-buried secret will forever remain. It serves as a haunting reminder that the past is never truly dead, and that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always find its way to the surface. If you were moved by this story, please show your support by hitting that like button, subscribing to our channel, and turning on the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the darkest corners of human nature.